So we've been talking a little bit about this idea of the foreign policy bureaucracy. And I'd like to spend a little bit more time talking about sort of the bureaucrats, the people that sort of run that foreign policy bureaucracy. And so I think that in general, there's two different ways that you can maybe think about a bureaucracy, right? And so bureaucracies could be viewed as tools that are used by leaders to sort of direct and control the state. Or you could think about bureaucracies as the state. And I want to kind of dig into these different perspectives a little bit. If we're thinking about bureaucracies as tools, this is the mechanism by which presidents are able to implement their will. Presidents standing in the Oval Office shouting orders don't do a whole lot. In order for presidents to be able to actually affect events on the ground, they need to be able to communicate those orders and those intentions out to the bureaucracies in ways that are recognized as legally valid, that are recognized and directed to the appropriate people, and that get implemented. And it's through working the bureaucracy that presidents are able to direct policy and implement change on the ground. In general, bureaucracies are quite responsive to the will of presidents because presidents control resources, right? If a bureaucracy falls out of favor, it may not receive the budget allocation that it desires. Presidents tend to create sort of the first draft of the budget, even if Congress is the one that officially authorizes the funding. They oftentimes start with that process of what a president says he or she needs for the bureaucracy to be able to function. Presidents control appointments, right? The head of an agency, including the top couple tiers of the bureaucracy, are going to be political appointees, and the president can put in place somebody who is sort of sympathetic to the organization and sort of keeps the ship running as it has done before, or presidents can put in place somebody who is going to change things up, or who maybe doesn't believe in the organization, or who seeks to actively undermine it or its mission. And presidents have the power to sort of overrule bureaucratic decisions, right? And so if the president doesn't like the direction bureaucracy is going, or a rule that's being put in place, depending upon the degree of autonomy of that agency, the president may be able to directly intervene and say, no, that's not what you're doing, and sort of push in a different case. And so there's all these sort of incentives for bureaucracies to maintain a good working relationship with the president, and that means faithfully carrying out a president's directives. On the other hand, there's all this sort of anecdotal evidence historically of presidents being frustrated with bureaucracies and feeling like they don't really have control of bureaucracies. There's sort of a famous quote of Truman where he's sort of lamenting, poor Eisenhower coming in and trying to take over. And Truman says, Eisenhower, he's used to being a general. When you're a general, people listen to you, but when you're a president, nobody in the bureaucracy listens to you. And what Truman is essentially saying is that bureaucrats are career appointee, lifetime oftentimes appointees who've had lots and lots of time in their organizations to develop a affinity for that organization, to understand sort of the nuts and bolts of how that organization operates, to become vested in what that organization does. And it becomes very difficult for presidents to actually sort of direct and control and move people out of those sort of entrenched routines where people sort of resist and say, no, that's not how it's done. We've been doing it this way for 20 years. And in order to sort of make that kind of change in how an organization functions and sort of how it operates requires a great deal of attention, which presidents oftentimes don't have the ability to sort of micromanage a given bureaucracy. And they don't always have the ability to sort of outlast people who are going to be in that organization for 20 or 30 years. Presidents are, here today, gone tomorrow, which is why a president or a presidential team that has a very sophisticated understanding of the bureaucracy can be very effective. In fact, that's one of the things that made Dick Cheney such a effective vice president and champion of the Bush administration's policy goals, is that Dick Cheney knew who to call in the sort of lower levels of the bureaucracy to be able to scream at the right person to get change to happen. And that's something that is not always the case in administrations. When we think about sort of who is on the other end of that phone call being screamed at by Dick Cheney, sometimes they're political operatives, right? These are people who were brought in by the president. They're people who maybe have worked on campaigns or who've been active in the party infrastructure for years, if not decades, and they're going to be put into positions of authority because they're loyal to the president. And maybe they share the president's political philosophy, or philosophy for what that organization should be doing. And those folks may see their job as much about being responsive to the president's desires, as it is to sort of monitor the professionals. Within the Soviet Union, there was a bureaucratic structure. It's actually quite common in totalitarian regimes generally, where you have sort of the administrative appointment and then you have the political appointment that runs parallel to it. And so there's always somebody sort of there watching, that's sort of on a parallel level, that's representing the interests of the party rather than representing the organization and doing the work. And in the United States, it's not quite that sort of stark in terms of that divide between every job having a political appointee sort of monitoring the competent administrative person who's doing the work. But that is part of the role of those political appointees, is to make sure that the president's will is being faithfully carried out. But the vast majority of the people who make up the bureaucracy are not those political appointees. They are selected because they have some expertise, because they've passed different qualifications to get in, right? So that might be the civil service exam. If you're going to work for the State Department, there's a very rigorous selection process to get into the Foreign Service, where you pass an exam for the Foreign Service, then you get brought in for an interview, and then there's a sort of placement process. Some people are coming through military academies or service in the military. So they're going through these selection processes that in theory are designed to identify people with knowledge and skills that are going to be important for the organization. And because they're sort of hired into the organization and they're socialized into the organization and they, see their career as tied to that organization, that tends to be the loyalty of that group of people, that they're maybe more interested in the long-term health of the organization than they are in whatever presidents are trying to do. And so occasionally you see that coming into conflict. After Dick Cheney effectively was able to manipulate the intelligence process leading up to the Iraq War, he was trying something very similar in 2006, 2007 with Iran. And the Central Intelligence Agency decided that they had had enough, that that their credibility was being damaged, that their reputation was being traded on, and information was being put out into the public that wasn't necessarily accurate. And so the intelligence community essentially advocated for the release of a national intelligence estimate on Iran's nuclear program, to basically say there's no grounds for the extremist description of events that are being put out by the administration. And again, so that loyalty to the organization of the bureaucrats within the organization saying, we need to defend our organization, even if it conflicts with what the president is trying to do, is I think a central part of the bureaucratic political tension that is central to how bureaucracies operate in free societies. One thing I do want to flag that I think is kind of an interesting development, and something I didn't necessarily appreciate fully until I attended a director of national intelligence sort of program on this a number of years back, is just how much the foreign policy bureaucracy, those bureaucrats who are sort of running the show, have shifted from being almost exclusively white, almost exclusively male, and being drawn almost exclusively from elite institutions, Princeton, Harvard, Yale, that sort of crowd, along with sort of military folks, to being a much more diverse group of people. And part of that change is that some institutional barriers have been removed, right? And so for a long time, just the security clearance process was set up in such a way where anything that wasn't a sort of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant sort of elite East Coast background was viewed as potentially suspect, as potentially not really in the interest of the United States, as potentially questionable. And so folks who were recent immigrants were oftentimes blocked. If you were homosexual, you were blocked from security clearance. Women and minorities oftentimes had a very difficult time getting a foothold into these organizations. And the culture sort of maintained that. But over the last 30, I mean, we'd say 50 years, I'll stick with 30, that has really started to change, that the foreign policy bureaucracy has become much more diverse. And there are active programs to try to encourage diversity within the foreign policy establishment. So like I said, the Director of National Intelligence ran a program that was trying to recruit folks into the intelligence community from universities with a great deal of diversity in their student population. There's the Wrangle Fellowship or Scholarship Program that tries to recruit folks from a more diverse background into the foreign policy establishment. So there are programs out there. I've been involved in the Boren selection process, and I can tell you that when we're sitting around the table debating applications, they recognize like we can't have all of our applicants coming from Johns Hopkins. Like it's a great school. They really specialize in foreign service, but that's just not viable. And so let's go back to the pile. And here is a application from, Western Arkansas State. You all rank this as a good application. Is this, a good enough application that we can include this in our slate that we put forward, even if it means bumping out somebody from an elite institution that has had everything sort of, packaged for them by sort of an inside crowd. And oftentimes we go back and say, yeah, these are two cases. These are really probably equivalent. Let's give the coin flip to, Western Arkansas State, because that person is going to bring in a perspective that's, maybe valuable and useful and outside of what you're going to be getting at SAIS and Johns Hopkins. And that really, I think, gets to the heart of what is going on in the shift in the foreign policy bureaucracy. It's not just sort of the legal and cultural shift that's happening within the United States. It's also, there's this recognition that the United States for a long time has had blinders on because of its lack of diversity within its foreign policy establishment. And so I'll flag a couple ways that this plays out. So at the Director of National Intelligence forum I went to, there was a really strong emphasis that because the intelligence community operates sort of in secret, that it's not sort of subject to the same kind of sort of oversight and public attitudes. In order for the intelligence community to have legitimacy within the public, it needs to reflect the public. It cannot be drawn from one small, narrow sliver of American society and expect to be taken as credible by American society as an organization that's representing the American public. Another way that plays out is just thinking just the nuts and bolts practicality, right? If you are trying to operate internationally, having people from immigrant backgrounds is incredibly valuable. They may have language skills or some cultural, affinities that are going to be incredibly valuable in the field or, at the bargaining table, and excluding those folks systematically from the process of participating in the foreign policy. It just didn't make practical sense. But then there's also a recognition of sort of bureaucratic groupthink, and so this is something that came out in an assessment this was an intelligence assessment on whether or not there would be violence in Kosovo. This was in the early 1990s. Yugoslavia was breaking up, and sort of Serbia, this sort of rump state, still had control of this region of Kosovo. And there was a question about, would Kosovo Albanians try to break free and try to resent sort of over being controlled by a Serb nationalist government. And the initial round of the intelligence report, which was drafted primarily by folks who were white, said, nah, it'll be fine. The Albanians are treated reasonably well. and other minority groups in Serbia have it worse, so they'll be fine. There won't be violence. And there were, I think, two African Americans on that committee that forming that judgment who protested and said, "This is absurd. Your assertion as folks coming from the majority that this minority community is treated pretty well by comparison is not going to sway folks in that minority community that their discrimination is therefore legitimate or acceptable or justified. There's going to be resentment there. I can tell you that there's going to be resentment there. And you're not recognizing it because you're coming at it from the perspective of the dominant culture." And when they made that case, suddenly people sort of perked up and said, "Oh, crap, this is my cultural blinders on that I missed sort of how that's operating." And that judgment got changed to one that ends up being accurate. There was mobilization and pushback, and eventually a war in Kosovo between the Kosovo Albanians and the Serb-led government. And having that sort of diversity of perspectives at the table allowed for that judgment to be improved. And that's really the promise of sort of diversifying the foreign policy bureaucracies, that you're less likely to fall victim to groupthink if you have multiple perspectives at the table and people who are willing to advocate for those perspectives.